Good afternoon, councillors. Good afternoon, officers. Welcome to this special meeting of Economy and Development Select. There's one principal item on the agenda today, and that's the pre-decision scrutiny on the Abergavenny Castles Events Pavilion project. So before I hand over to officers, can we just do a quick intro for everyone and for everyone who's watching? So I'm Councillor Paul Pavia and I'm chair of the committee.
Paula Harris, Democratic Services.
Ian Saunders, Head of Tourism, Leisure, Culture and Youth.
Kath Fallon, Head of Enterprise and Community Development.
Rachel Rogers, Monmouthshire Museums Manager.
Jez Becker, committee member and a member of the community as well.
Alan Davis, committee member.
Matt Feakins, committee member.
Ryan Strong, committee member.
David Dovey, committee member.
Thank you all very much. Obviously, can I, in terms of housekeeping, just remind you that make sure your phones are switched off and obviously use your microphones as we go on and ask questions. So the purposes of this particular item is to seek comments and consideration regarding the Abergavenny Castle feasibility study. So I think Kath is going to open up and set the scene, and then the other officers will move in and pitch in as we go. Okay, thanks, Kath.
Thank you. We just thought it might be useful just to give you a bit of background as to how we got here, really, for new committee members. In 2014-15, we did an independent review of the museum service, really to look at potential future delivery options with a view to making services sustainable and also looking at potential income generation. Last December, following Economy and Development Select consideration, Cabinet accepted the findings of the review that had been undertaken by AMIAN and approved a 5-year forward plan, which was to receive and consider individual cases as appropriate, and this is one of these. For information, the plan included several activities. One was the introduction of a centralised team structure. Prior to that, the museums had been working quite independently, and we felt there was a need to improve efficiency and enable coordination of budgets and also our income generation. This was approved back in December last year and has been implemented, hence Rachel's new role as museums manager. And also we looked at other activities, which included the creation of a collection centre and a centralised store, which we're looking at HLF funding for now, but also other individual site recommendations, which are the outdoor event structure at Abergavenny to increase income generation potential that Rachel's going to talk to you about in a moment. Consolidation of the public displays relating to Nelson and the history of Monmouth and the surrounding area, so we'll be looking at that in the future, along with the viability of a new cafe and enhanced exhibition opportunities in Chepstow, and also looking at an assessment of the Caldicot social history and the Nelson collection currently held at Caldicot Castle in collaboration with the community. So it's one of the first cases that we'll be bringing forward for your consideration. So if I hand over to Rachel, she'll talk you through the details.
Thank you, Kath. Just to set a bit of scene about our role in the museums, our role, we see it, is to inspire a passion for our county by bringing together museums, heritage, arts and culture alive with our communities and visitors. We aim to inspire a sense of community pride, and we also look to identify opportunities within the arts and cultural development for our users. We also aim to have a resilient and sustainable service by both extending our income streams, increasing and widening our user base and raising awareness of the museum offer, whilst also contributing to the communities by adapting and working in new and innovative ways. Events is a way of bringing these things together. We can bring our communities and visitors together within our historic and cultural sites and deliver these aspirations. As Kath has explained, the museum service has been subject to external review, and we've also spent a lot of time internally looking at it as well. And Abergavenny Castle, where there's been a history of community events since the 1880s, was identified as a space where we could develop the potential further. The lack of a covered space has been identified by users of the site as a barrier to utilising the castle grounds fully, which is why we've put this project together. You've got lots of details in front of you, I'm aware of, but if I can just summarise some key areas for consideration. The events feasibility study, which is Appendix 2 in your papers, has been at the heart of this work, providing guidance on how we should utilise the site to its full advantage, providing an opportunity to both increase the sustainability of the site through income generation, but also by increasing its role within the community. As a result of that work, we've got a draft 5-year events plan. It's important to bear in mind that what we're looking to do is to provide an events programme that will ensure the castle remains and develops as a lively resource for the community. We expect the programme to become self-sustainable, and we expect it to provide a small profit. We don't expect huge, extensive profits from it, as we recognise that the importance of the opportunities to the community will outweigh that of the commercial. However, we will remain ambitious in our programming, and self-sustainability will be a key driver. The full explanation of the strategy and the key conclusions from the feasibility are all within the business case, which forms Appendix 1 of your papers. The team carrying out the events feasibility study examined the idea of a structure and concluded it would be a useful addition to the site. They provided advice regarding size and design, and that information was incorporated within the design process. Appendix A within the papers shows draft designs and the location within the area of the castle. The design's been through several iterations, taking on board comments along the way from both experts and stakeholders. We're currently looking at the designs that you have in front of you in conjunction with the pre-planning advice that we've just received. The area on the left-hand side as you come in through the main castle gates is considered to be the best location for the building. This area falls outside the Scheduled Ancient Monument, although it's still within the registered historic parks and gardens, the conservation area, and within the listed exterior walls. We've had a geophysical survey of the area done to consider the archaeological evidence, and advice from that study was also included within the design and with regards to the positioning. Discussions have taken place with key stakeholders, CADU and the Neville Estate Company, along with local groups and residents, and with relevant officers through a pre-planning application. We're preparing a heritage impact assessment to ensure there's not a negative effect on the historic monument, and we've commissioned a noise impact assessment. This will ascertain the current noise in the area, the noise any future events might cause, and how the structure may be able to mitigate that. It will also inform how we incorporate temporary sides within the building. Regarding the design, it's important to be clear we're not trying to recreate a structure along the lines of a village hall. What we're trying to do is recreate something akin to a permanent marquee. We've explored the idea of using temporary marquees on a more regular basis. However, there are several barriers preventing this. The ongoing revenue cost of hiring marquees is extremely difficult to sustain. It's much easier to secure capital funding for a more permanent structure. Buying a marquee leaves us with issues regarding storage and the safe erection of a marquee with a very limited non-technical team. If a marquee is up for a period longer than 28 days, it's become subject to planning considerations. And whilst we could put up marquees for large events only for shorter period of time, that doesn't allow us to provide a shelter on a more ad hoc basis, which a permanent would be. One would, for example, for visiting school groups, eating their lunch, for community groups, being able to use it for an hour or two at a time. We've applied for grants from several funding strands, which we're waiting to hear back from. Probably around January for the bulk of the decisions there. And we are also, say we've put a pre-planning application in. We are submitting the final planning application when we've had the final impact assessments relating to noise and heritage, with the intention that it would be ready in time to go before the January planning committee, so we can hear about all of the planning and funding at the same time. If everything is successful, We are looking to carry out the year 1 of the draft events programme that has been produced as part of the feasibility during the summer of 2018. During that time, we would put out a tender for the building works so that we could carry out the building between autumn 2018 and spring 2019. So a structure would be in place, ready for the 2019 season, so year 2 of the events. The events plan runs until 2022, and of course during that time we would be reviewing it to enable us to then plan for the next 5 years. That concludes what I want to say, so we would look to seek for your comments on the events feasibility study, an endorsement for the business case and the request for a loan from reserves. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. Ian, was there anything else you want to add at this stage?
Only the fact of having taken part in all the consultations and the workshops that this is a really positive piece of work, and Kath is right about the community involvement in this project. There's been extensive workshops where there's been a lot of positivity around this structure, and Rachel mentioned the long history of events at the castle, and I think it's something that we've stepped away from in recent years, and this will just obviously establish it, and it will give it a base to thrive in the future. So I think it's very positive from everything I've observed of the process.
Okay, thanks very much. Before I go into questions, so excited was I to get into item 3. I missed items 1 and 2. So item 1 was apologies. Do we have any apologies?
Thank you, Chair. Received apologies from County Councillors Roden and Blakeborough.
Great, thank you very much. And item 2 is obviously declarations. I don't know whether anyone has a declaration on this particular item. Probably not. But if something does come to you, obviously, through the process, do flag it up, and we'll get the relevant forms to you. So in terms of questions, Councillor Davis?
Thank you for the document. I like the document. I think it's very well presented. I'm going to change my initial question because I think you've answered that question. I mean, one of the things that is missing from this document is those financial generation projections. And I think you're saying now that you don't expect to make any money from these.
Sorry, it was deliberately excluded because we felt that the figures in terms of events going forward were, commercially sensitive, so that we wouldn't sort of share it at this stage. But you are right. I mean, we're not claiming to save the world with this. We were looking, though, that by the end of year 5, we would be making a small profit, but within that we would be we'd included being able to pay the loan back if that is approved, and we were looking at having some sort of part-time events coordinator in whatever form that took, because we acknowledge that actually trying to do it within the current museum structure to run all these things was very ambitious, but yes, I mean, we were looking at the end by year 5, it was a few £1,000s rather than tens or hundreds of thousands of pounds. But what we felt was important was the how it sort of fitted in with the community. We took that deliberate decision that the majority of the events would be community focused rather than being commercially focused.
Well, I got my business head on now. Okay, so from the document, you're asking for a £32,000 loan off the authority. And this section of our operations is in excess of £300,000 in deficit. Is that correct? That's what the figures are telling me. So what I'm having difficulty with is, if in the current financial situation that we were in, I thought we were looking at any initiatives that we put forward would also have an income generation element to them. Because clearly we can't carry on with these sort of deficit figures indefinitely. And certainly this project doesn't do that. It has very little, if any, impact. So you're actually asking the authority to give you £32,000, which could be the salary of one employee for a year. It could be something that could be spent on education or social services. And really what you were saying is, well, we're not really interested in the financial return at all, really. It's purely about the community of Abergavenny. Now, in this current economic situation, I have a little bit of a difficulty with that, because I thought as an authority we were looking to put things in place that did generate income and therefore reduce those deficits. And this clearly doesn't do that. So I am obviously on the wrong planet here, because I just don't see that you're going to spend £250,000 on a wooden structure so that people don't get wet, but it's not actually going to bring any benefit to the authority at all. So can you convince me that this really should be done?
Yeah, just regarding the deficit you mentioned, obviously that's the cost of the museum service you're talking about there, and the whole service, which includes obviously three different areas, well, 4 collections and 3 buildings at present. And clearly the 5-year business plan for the museums is about rationalisation and looking at better ways of running services and interconnecting. And clearly, this project is something that is going to give back a little bit to the community about an asset and the estate and what that could or couldn't be on that site. I mean, you're right. This is not looking at the commercial side of the museum service, but it's looking at putting a structure in there that the community can use for the next 100 to 200 years. So it's a decision that I think you've got to balance it between a community asset that will be well used, and the service will do their best to tell heritage and all the different stories of Abergavenny and those things, against a purely commercial driven decision. So I think that's probably where I would come from if I was answering that on behalf of Rachel, but I'll let Rachel add to that.
I think it's important to remember that it would be an asset for the whole of Monmouthshire and beyond, and not just for Abergavenny. And certainly our visitors and users come from an area much wider than Abergavenny. So I think it's quite important to remember that. I don't think it's true to say that we haven't considered at all that the income generation isn't important. As I say, from within that, we've allowed within the first 5 years to be able to be repaying the loan, to have a funded member of staff so it washes its face completely and brings in a small profit as well, which, whilst it's not going to it's certainly not going to save the authority, but in terms of being able to contribute within the relatively small budget that the museum service has, it means that we can become more self-sustainable. And I think that's what I wanted to get across to members, that this was about. I don't want to come in and make wild claims about us making a fortune, but what it can do is it can mean that we within the museum service can become more sustainable. And then after the loan is paid back, then obviously it increases. And as Ian says, we're looking at a structure that could last for 100 years plus. So we're certainly not talking about, although it's a relatively large investment, it's certainly not something that 10 years down the road we're going to be having the conversation again. It's a long-term investment when you look at it like that over 100 years or so. It's a comparatively small amount. But I think it's important to be realistic about what we can do with events. We've also tried to be quite cautious as well with it, and the emphasis has been very much on the community side of things. And when I talk about community, I do also mean paid for events like theatre, concerts, etc., that the community could come to, as opposed to things like weddings, etc., which is one that's been, a type of event that's been talked about, and it's obviously something that can be looked at. But we felt it was important to make sure the balance was more towards things that residents of Monmouthshire and visitors to Monmouthshire could get involved in, rather than something that perhaps a few select individuals could. But as I said, we've got a 5-year plan, and one of the really important things throughout that first 5 years will be to look at what works, what doesn't, what are the things that make money. If they're not making money, are there other benefits as well? And it's one of the things that we ask ourselves quite a lot. If something's not bringing in a large financial amount, what is the benefit, and does that particular benefit outweigh the financial? And I think it's important to take all of those things on board.
I just make one more comment. I mean, as somebody who lives in Caldicot, quite near Caldicot Castle, I'm sure there are lots, and councillors represent different areas here. Lots of us would like £250,000 spent on something that isn't going to generate any income, but does something for the community, and I'm sure there are a lot of projects that we could spend £250,000 on that would generate some real income for us, and would reduce the deficit within your overall, because even though you're separate units, as Ian says, if you look at this as a business, your business is £300,000 in deficit. Right? So, and I'm not seeing anything that is going to do anything to reduce that. So personally, I can't back this scheme because I don't think it's been thought out correctly. I don't think it's been done on the right basis. It's very nice for them to have a shelter in Abergavenny when they're not going to get wet, but all of us would like one of those. So I'm sorry, I can't see as the case is made at all. Thank you.
Councillor Beck, I think, was next. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Quick question to start. In your 5-year events plan, how many of those events, just roughly, do you think wouldn't happen if you had a permanent structure? If you didn't have a permanent structure. So if you don't build the structure, is there a lot in there that you wouldn't be able to do because you can't hire the marquees or?
I mean, any of them can happen without a structure, but I don't think we would take the risk. So what we tend to do now is because the weather is such a big factor, we might do perhaps 1 or 2 theatre events, for example, outdoor theatre events, whereas if we had the structure, we could start doing 4 or 5, for example. So we'd have a lot less risk with those sorts of events. But another big area which we don't really do at all at the moment is when they did the feasibility and spoke to different groups, there seemed to be a market for people who wanted sort of that indoor-outdoor space for things like yoga, tai chi, that kind of thing. So you start to hire it out for an hour or 2 at a time. So people that don't necessarily want to be inside, but just want a space, and it's got to be a dry space as well. We'd also be looking at having electricity, etc., with it as well. So that obviously brings a flexibility for groups that we don't have at the moment. We've also in the past tried to do events like outdoor market type things, like Christmas markets and things, which we've done with marquees, and that's been very time consuming and very it's expensive if you get in marquees, and it's very time consuming as well. So things like that would just be able to happen very, very easily.
Certainly the structure resembles a traditional classic sort of indoor market square, doesn't it? If I had my business head on, I would probably agree with my friend here. I mean, it doesn't really, you're entering into a space which is very heavily competitive. Lots of schemes in lots of different parts of the county to try and get this kind of eventing coming to them. However, if I take my business head off and I look at it from the wider economic angle, I look at it and I think, well, we have been saying about how important the intangible quality of Monmouthshire's surroundings is in bringing in new trade and new people who want to live here. I see this as the kind of project that could be a small touch towards that kind of intangibility. Yes, you won't find it on the bottom line, but you will find it making a difference to whether people want to live there and the vibrancy of the community. I look at things like when we got a covered area into Chepstow Castle, and because it's Cadw, we had a huge range now of eventing that goes on there, but absolutely, not really, I say none, but very few community events. It's not open. It's not very easy for somebody to have a wedding or a christening or something like that there. It would be nice to see a structure that is used in the community in that way. Is it good? Would it encourage tourism? Maybe, maybe not. I think you've already got a footfall in the area. I don't think it's necessarily going to change the amount of footfall you're getting. So this is very much more for the local community rather than a business case, as far as I can see it. Can we afford it? Well, that depends whether it's value for money, doesn't it? Can we afford it? No, because we can't afford anything at the moment. But is it value for money over the longer term and feeding into that intangibility of Monmouthshire as a place that's desirable to live in? I'm inclined to say yes. You know, from our point of view, if it can wash its own face, I think that's a good thing. I mean, how certain are you that it will wash its own face? I mean, it's a very positive and rosy thing in any business plan when you come up with the predictions. So of course you're going to say yes, but I mean, you know, can you give us any degree of certitude, any sort of research that's been done that actually says that really is how it's going to be? So.
I mean, obviously, you know, in terms of the money, it depends on where the grants come in, and we have very deliberately gone for grants rather than trying to raise £250,000 ourselves. I mean, in terms of the events and the income and expenditure that we did then, we based the figures on events that we already do, and what the figures were looking like over several years. Some of the events we're not actually doing, but we kind of looked at similar things that we'd done as well, and the experience that the guys doing the feasibility had as well. We've been cautious in our figures, etc. So when we were looking at what sort of numbers would you expect, we've tried not to sort of pick our busiest events. We've tried to be much more cautious with it. So you know, we think it's pretty solid as far as I can ever give that guarantee. I mean, the thing is with having a structure though is, without the structure, I mean, we do events as it is at the moment. And without a structure, we're incredibly uncertain through the summer, because we might pick up an outdoor theatre event, which we do lots of. And I know that when I book it, if it rains that night, we're not going to do as well with, you know, whatever marketing we do. If we have a covered structure, it all of a sudden becomes a very different prospect. And so, I mean, you know, it goes back to the question previously about, you know, what things wouldn't we be able to do. It's not that we necessarily wouldn't be able to do it without a structure. It just means that our audience is probably much more likely to come knowing that they've got a roof. I think as well, it's interesting what you said about those kind of intangible benefits that we don't necessarily see, because we did a piece of work a few years ago where we looked at the economic impact of the Monmouthshire Museum Service on Monmouthshire as a whole and the wider economy, and we brought in something like £1.24 million. Well, clearly we don't see that, but it was interesting to see what the things that we are doing that are bringing people to the area, which then has an impact on the wider community. So whilst the benefits may not all be ours, and that's why as part of the feasibility we spoke a lot to local businesses about how we could work with them and to make sure that we weren't treading on their toes, so that we were getting some benefit, but that, you know, the local guys in the area were also getting something out of it.
Okay.
I just wanted to pick up on a couple of points really with regards sort of the local economic development aspect. I mean, the feasibility has been funded through the LEADER programme, and the purpose of that is to test whether or not there is a market for what we're looking at, and also for the outdoor structure. The event structure will be funded 80% through the Rural Community Development Fund, which is the capital aspect of that programme. It goes through quite vigorous tests with Welsh Government to ensure that it is viable. The Chepstow Castle covered sort of area would have gone through the same test. It was a similar pot of money. So they do sort of quite stringently test it. I think in terms of the actual outdoor structure, what it will provide is quite a unique venue. It's rare that you get a castle with an outdoor structure within that, and to the quality that we're looking at. So it certainly gives us an opportunity to grow markets we're not currently in. And also in terms of the outdoor space, it is considered very highly by the local community, and I think certainly through the Abergavenny Food Festival have used it on a very regular basis, and I'm sure if that structure was to become permanent, that would be something they would use a lot more. Currently they only really use the Market Hall for their winter festival, for example. That opens up loads of opportunities there for them. The other thing we haven't really talked about is the fact that when we look at the centralised store, that will enable us to move some of the objects out of Abergavenny Castle and into a centralised store, which will open up space within the castle building for us to bring in sort of artists in residence and various other opportunities, sort of businesses to use that office space. That therefore drives us with an additional market for the outdoor event structure. So although at the moment it might look like the margins are tight, I do think it's a market that is untapped and has huge potential.
Thanks. Just to come back on it, Chair, I'd say that, I mean, if there is a chance that it's even going to tread water, I think the benefits in that intangible sense are worth backing a project like this, and I'd urge my colleagues to think of that wider economic scenario when we're looking at it. So, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Becker. Councillor Fegans.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all. In short, it's the £32,000 loan, which we're putting forward as a loan. I haven't seen the sort of repayment schedule of that loan, and I'm not so sure that it would be repaid as a loan. The capital costs for us to carry that would be about £2,240 a year just on interest payments. So over a 10-year period, you're looking at sort of £5,000 and a bit a year to repay that loan back to us. Overall, I agree with what Jez has just said, that I think, you know, that what the scheme can offer the residents of Abergavenny could be substantial. Notwithstanding, going through the document, looking at the events that are taking place at the moment, they're largely housed in marquees or inflatable domes or exteriorly held domes, so sort of quite unique spaces, really. I'm not saying that this wouldn't add a great deal to that to the spaces. The benefit of the more transferable sort of type marquees, etc., means that they can be put up as and when they're needed, and to suit the venue as and when it's needed. This is a relatively small hall in a lot of regards. You know, it's not going to house 500 people. It's not going to house, you know, it's about 100 and something odd, I think, 140 or 50, is it?
There's a design as it is at the moment. It would formally seat about 150 people.
Okay, thanks for that. So it is a good asset, but it's not going to house the theatre, for argument's sake. You know, if there is an outdoor theatre, it's not going to maybe house everyone in that scenario. So it will have its limitations. It has got its constraints regarding the budget, you know, funding, to see how that's going to be paid back. I personally would prefer to have seen that formalised in some sort of way, but I understand that obviously if you are going for the rural development capital fund, there might be constraints within that. But if there was more of a formalised approach to, if that was a proper, if it's a loan, let's call it a loan. If it's a grant, let's call it a grant. Let's know where we are with it. Obviously, if it's a loan, then we should really be looking for interest. And then you're talking £20,000 on top of the loan itself in interest repayments, because the cost of capital to us as a council is XYZ. So that certainly puts a very different perspective on it then. And in some regards, a £32,000 loan, a £32,000 grant from us, in my thinking, is probably an easier sell than saying it's effectively a £55,000 a loan. So a grant at 30 grand is very different to a 55 grand, which is effectively the interest plus the loan repaid. So there's a couple of things there which I'm a little bit unsure about. I think the presentation of what you've done here is fantastic. I think the research that's gone in the background of it is fantastic, and I think, you know, there's a huge amount of work's gone into it. I personally think that if we was to invest in a block of toilets, that would give us a far, or would solve many more problems that are coming from the site, considering there's no WCs, and all the WCs at the moment are coming in as portaloos. You know, if you've got 150 people coming in or more people coming in, and all of those have got to come in and they've got to use portaloos, that's not a great service. That's not sort of starting at the basics and sort of working up from there. So to me, to buy, as Monmouthshire County Council, to buy a sort of comprehensive towable portaloo, you know, sort of posh loo sort of thing, would make more sense than putting up a wooden building. That being said, we're not getting a capital grant to do that. So, you know, got to weigh all these things in together, but certainly bang for buck, a toilet would add a lot more value to us and would still be a capital receipt on our balance sheet. So all of those being said, you know, it doesn't detract from the fact that I can see, as Jez is pointing out, that it's got some, you know, far greater attributes to it, and it can provide much more to the local setting and to the local community. But then going on to the setting of it, it's not our setting, we don't own the land, we've got a lease expiring in 2020. Obviously it comes as a capital fund, and I'm guessing you've addressed some of these issues within that application. you know, we're creating a capital asset and planting it on to a site that we've only got a 3-year term of lease on. We haven't got any renewal in that lease position. This would be tenants' improvements. It would be, I think, crucial before we used to move forward to see how the owner of the land would treat tenants' improvements. If they would simply adopt those at the end of the 3 years, our position then would be wholly out of sync to the capital situation, in as much as that we would have walked away from a very substantial capital asset. The owner would then be able to charge more for his rent because he's then got a significant asset. And so there's some little technical legal things which I think we need to iron out. And so I'll put that back to you just to see if you can answer those legal issues, really.
Throughout this process, we've spoken a lot to the Neville estate, who are very supportive, and in fact part funded the feasibility study as well. So they are very supportive of the project. I spoke to Lord Abergavenny last week, and I did say that, you know, if this all comes to fruition, we can't start building something if our lease runs out 3 years later, and he completely understands that, and said that it would probably be quite useful to meet sooner rather than later to start talking about the next lease. So it's completely at the front of their mind. They completely understand that we're not going to build something if the lease runs out in 2020. So you know, the way that when I spoke about it with him, I said that if we get the grant, if we get planning, before we start spending all that money, we would need to get the lease redone, and the period of time. The last one that we did for a period of 10 years. We have had them previously for 20. I think when I've spoken to him in the past, he's open to 10, 20 years. That would be a conversation we'd have to have internally as well. They're certainly not averse to the idea of longer leases, because in the past we've discussed with them, if, for example, we had a Heritage Lottery Fund grant, they asked for 25-year leases, and they've always been very open to that idea. So I think we're all on the same page there, and the Neville estate certainly expect that if this got given the go-ahead, then we'd have to do something about a lease running out before 2020, because clearly that would be madness.
Come back on that one point then. It'd be interesting to see Mark Cowcroft's take on that, just to see how that capital asset sits within our balance sheet. And I'm assuming that if we was to take on a longer lease, that lease itself would add value and would sit on our capital asset. So that would be something to strive for, I would imagine. But in short, my takeaway from that conversation, in all honesty, would be to say that we can't do anything really until we know the position of that lease. It's either going to come back on the same terms, more favourable terms maybe, if he's engaged in that process. It's an asset if we was to walk away from, would be a significant detractor from his estate. So my thinking would be that we can't. That is something we need at the front end of that process. So I wouldn't probably be able to make a decision today based on that information, I'm afraid.
Councillor Becker.
Thanks, Chair. Just to echo that sentiment. I mean, we've been in Chepstow recently through some negotiations with the Denny family regarding different parts of the castle grounds there, and they can be quite drawn out. And depending on who you're talking to in the structure, it's good that you're talking to the organ grinder, not the monkey, because some people, if you leave it to the mechanisms, they will want to up the rent, especially if they see it as being vital to an asset that you want to build. So absolutely, I mean, if there's going to be a negotiation, it needs to be either on favourable terms or on the similar terms, not let's up the money because they want to build something there. And if you say, I mean, it's great that they're supportive of it, it'd be nice if they're supportive of it to the tune of £32,000. Have you perhaps asked them?
Yes, I have spoken to them about, because I said that I expected to be asked that very question this week. What Lord Abergavenny said was he was very supportive about it. He would be certainly willing to look at probably an interest-free loan rather than a gift. But in terms of how much, he said, well, let's see what comes in from the different grants where the gap might be, and we can look at something then. So he wasn't giving me money there and then, but they have been very supportive throughout. So I don't see any reason to assume that the lease will be a stumbling block. They know as well that we're not talking about putting something up and then making tens and hundreds of thousands of pounds. They know where we sit. The castle has been in through either the county council or the borough council or the town commissioners before that since the 1880s. So and for many years on no rent whatsoever. So I think that they don't necessarily see us as being a commercial asset within their portfolio. We do some good things with the community, and so I don't see any reason to worry about the lease, but I mean, you're completely right. We need to have that discussion, and I think that's why when we spoke last week, he suggested that perhaps we have that conversation before we hear back, so that we all kind of know where we are, rather than waiting in January and then saying, "Oh, right, we've got to make a decision quickly now." But I was led to believe that it would be on similar terms to what we've got now.
That sounds sensible and favourable. I think if you could talk to them as soon as possible.
Councillor Feakins.
Thanks again. And I don't sit on Abergavenny Town Council, but I do sit on Monmouth Town Council, as you know. And we do everything we can to support local services as well. Have Abergavenny Town Council been approached for the £32,000 out of interest? And maybe just spin it back on its head again regarding the toilet block. If we was to say to ourselves, let's invest in the toilet block to make this really work, because that would solve so many problems for this, and make the whole venue viable for many different events, not just for what could potentially happen in this, but going into the food festival and all sorts. And maybe if we were to propose that to Abergavenny Town Council, that we buy the toilet blocks as a capital asset, and they put forward the 32 grand, just as a thought process, just whilst we're in those discussions.
I haven't spoken to the Town Council about this. The Town Council, they put some money towards the feasibility study, so they are aware of it. I've come here first just because I felt that was kind of the right order to do things in. So I mean that's why I haven't spoken to them. But as I say, they are aware of the project. They funded the feasibility. It also sits within the North Monmouthshire 5-year plan about increasing events at the castle as well. So that group's very involved in it. So there are lots of groups that are aware of it. The toilets is an interesting one. I mean, I wouldn't want toilets instead of this structure, and we did, but we did sort of consider this. Do we look at this as a bigger pot of money and include toilets as well with it? I think there's fors and against with it. I am a little concerned about kind of the ongoing maintenance, the opportunities for vandalism of things like toilets, but I mean, those things can be overcome, and we can look at that. But I mean, that's why we didn't put it into the original bid, and also because the margins are so tight with everything. But I don't disagree that obviously it would add to it if we had that as well.
Councillor Strong.
Yeah, there have been quite a lot of good points made, and obviously the lease is the most important thing to get settled first of all. I've been to quite a few outdoor events at Chepstow and Abergavenny castles. Unfortunately, they've always been either wet or very cold, and I've shivered and suffered afterwards. But I can see if you've got a room that'll take 150 people, that would cater for most of the people that attend these events, and could be a money spinner. I think you sort of skated over the use of this site for weddings, because I know that I represent Usk Town Council, or Usk Town, and the Sessions House there has recently had a licence granted to hold weddings there, and it is quite a money spinner. So you probably will get quite a good revenue, I think, from that. I think we really have to see what happens with the lease. I think the 30,000 we may not have to find. Hopefully, if you can speak to the owner, and he'll stump up some of that. I think it would be. It's at the early stages of negotiation, obviously, and I think I'd back the scheme, but obviously subject to quite a few questions being answered prior to that.
I think you're right. Weddings is obviously an opportunity. It's one that lots of people bring up. So it was something we looked at within the feasibility. We've been quite cautious. We've suggested kind of 4 to 6 weddings a year for a couple of reasons. Partly because we felt we wanted to do more theatre, arts type based events that I guess a wider group can use rather than just a wedding. The other thing is when we were putting together the programme, it came immediately after the Abergavenny Food Festival. I don't know if any of you were there, but the ground afterwards, because it was a terrible weekend in terms of rain, and it did make you think that, of course, if you're doing events like weddings, thinking about that time for ground recovery afterwards. I mean, I know people have said to me, oh, you could have a wedding every weekend. And I sat there with an event organiser that was having an event the following weekend of the food festival, and I said, I'm very glad that you're not the bride and groom I'm talking to and that you're doing a music concert. So again, whilst we were being cautious in our income predictions, we also, when we put the programme together, very kind of deliberately thought, right, well, let's not just say we can run an event every single weekend or 3 or 4 times a week or throughout the summer. Let's just kind of think about, the Welsh weather being what it is and ground recovery. I mean, obviously, as time goes on, we can look at that, and so we had very cautious heads as a result of very bad weather.
Councillor Dovey.
Thank you, Chair. I think many of the points that I wish to have made have been made already by fellow members. I don't believe this building, attractive though it may look, will do anything additional for attracting new tourists to the area, because they won't know it exists until they get there. So if you're looking at incremental figures, I don't think you can use that as an argument. You might use it as an argument in terms of retaining business once you've got it. The other thing I'm concerned about is if we get this, then I know how things, you'll end up with a shell, which would be very nice, and then you've got to populate it with all sorts of facilities and everything to go in there. And where's that money coming from? Are we going to have to pay for that? I'm just minded of the sort of difference in scoping. We, as an old-timer here, and Brian will recall the battles we have had in this committee to try and get the smallest of things for Chepstow TIC. And I was constantly reminded by the Bob Greenland about how dire things were, and by everybody else. And so we have got very little at Chepstow TIC. Indeed, we want it to be profitable, and I've been arguing for some time that if it is to be profitable, then you've got to fit it out in some way that it is retail suitable, and not a penny has been spent on that, as far as I can see. It's, or if it is, it's very well camouflaged. And the other thing you ought to be doing is training your staff how to be retail familiar, so they have the skills to make the thing profitable. I don't want to be jaundiced at all about this, I really don't. But I don't like the economics of it very much at all. I think the tourism aspect is a false premise, maybe for return business. But I think this is a very nice way of getting a very nice facility in Abergavenny. I don't think Abergavenny make as much in terms of contribution out towards other things. If you look at the precept in Chepstow of what we come up with to support activities in Chepstow, I think perhaps it would be nice if we could see Abergavenny matching some of those. I mean, we look after all our own toilets and whatnot. I don't think we've even got to that stage with Abergavenny at the moment. So if we had the money, it would be great, I'm sure. But I'm definitely not for it at this time. And there are other things that go with it. And I've touched on a few of them, I think. And you might get people from Chepstow and Caldecott, the other end, the poorer end of Monmouthshire, who will look at that and say, oh, it's Abergavenny again. You know, it's Abergavenny again. So I'm not for it.
If I can just respond to a couple of points. I mean, as I said before, I would hope that it seems as a facility for the entire county, and certainly when we put on our events, then that's who we market to and that's who we see come. The other thing is you mentioned that the structure wouldn't bring tourists in because they wouldn't know it was there until they got there, and you're absolutely right. But I don't think we would claim that the structure brings people in. I think what we're actually saying is that the structure would mean that we could be much more ambitious with our events programming. We could put on more events because we wouldn't be concerned about worrying about things like the weather, etc. So the reason it would bring more people in is because we would be making a better offer to people that would be available more than it is at the moment. Yeah, by all means.
Councillor Devi, sorry, you're
I hear what you say, but got it. I hear what you say, but what number of people could you get in that building then for an event? Let's have a look at that.
So as it stands at the moment,
tourism event.
Yeah. So formally seated. So if you had a wedding, for example, the sort of round tables type thing.
No, hang on. You're changing the ground. No, you're talking about a wedding.
Okay.
That isn't
I was going to give you all of the. I was going to give you all of the figures.
I'm interested in the tourism. I understand the wedding.
Okay. Well, a seated.
That's a different sort of facility. We're talking about this as a facility, and it's being sold on the basis that it would do a lot for tourism. I can understand that. I can understand that. But if we wanted to put up as something that is supposed to be a wedding centre and that sort of thing in Chepstow,
if it was standing, it would be approximately 200 people. So seated 150, standing 200. They're the figures that we've looked at, and that's why I give you it as an example of formal seating. Clearly, if it was kind of your bench seating, auditorium type thing, it would be somewhere between those figures, perhaps about 170, 180. But I haven't worked out every different way. So 200 standing.
Yes, so if you had 200 people in there standing, and you were talking about what amount of that space was being allocated to the sort of business that you get from tourism who have arrived and it's wet or whatever, and what do you see where I'm trying to get at? You could say you could put 200 or 300 people in there, but if you're talking about tourism, you will not get 200 or 300 tourists in it if the weather isn't good. It's two different markets. You can't use that argument.
Sorry, I'm not quite sure that I follow. I mean, what we're saying is that at the moment, if we put on an event, there is no wet weather cover. So we're totally dependent on that, and we will have less people will come. People won't come to us if they know they're going to get wet. If we have a cover for them, logic dictates that more people will come, or as many people as would have come as if it had been a dry day.
What we haven't got,
Councillor Devi, your microphone.
Sorry, every other centre, Monmouth, Caldecott, Chepstow, we could all say that.
And I think at Chepstow they've benefited hugely as part of the festival from having the covered canopy at Chepstow Festival. I know that that's made an enormous amount of difference
yes,
to being able to run the events.
Yes, it did. And at that, it doesn't cover 200 or 300 people. If you've been there when it's raining, it will protect you from showers, and it isn't a building. I can't remember now whether Chepstow paid part of it, whole of it, or it was a contribution, but it isn't the sort of money and structure that we're talking about here. I think the case isn't made. I believe that so many of the foundations on which you build in this case are not appropriate, if you like. I don't buy it. Sorry about that. I am always a positive guy. I like to see things happen within the county, but this one doesn't ring my bell.
Thank you. I'll take your comments on board.
Can I, before I go back to Councillor Becker, I'm going to ask a few questions myself. I'm probably minded with some of my other colleagues. I'm not overly convinced about this business case, to be perfectly truthful with you. In terms of the added extra for the outside space, I mean, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about a pavilion to cover people to watch a performance, or we, in Chepstow, it's very much the canopy is there to cover the performers. The watching audience have to sit out and suffer the elements, come what may, whatever that may be. So I'm just interested in terms of how this is going to generate that additional capacity.
We saw it that it would be the audience that are being covered, because my experience of when we've done outdoor events and things, the actors tend to come with everything, with a stage already, and my experience of outdoor actors as well is they are extremely resilient, and it has to be incredibly bad weather before they start fading, so the audience tends to fade a lot quicker than the performers. Also performers, for things not outdoor events, but perhaps bands, for example, if there were music things, they tend to take a much smaller amount of space, so we could cover those with gazebos and things that we have in-house, which are a lot smaller. So I saw it very much as being a shelter for the audience, not the performers.
Okay. In terms of the risk management sheet, you've obviously underlined the fact about the grants, and you've highlighted it as being low if some of those grants are unsuccessful. What is your sort of feel that in terms of return on some of those grant applications at this stage? Do you think what percentage do you think are going to be successful?
It's difficult to say. The only one that I can sort of comment on at all really is the RCDF one, which is the biggest bulk of it. It's a stage. We went through stage 1 and we're now at stage 2. And on previous applications, people that have been successful through stage 1 have also been successful at stage 2. But I wouldn't like to guess, and the others I can't say.
Okay. In terms of the Kid Associates survey work, I was interested in the first section there, Abergavenny Castle Museum as historic and recreational public asset. You said 82% think it's perfectly acceptable to hold events in the grounds whilst allowing public access, etc. A significant 9% felt that it was not acceptable. Can you unpick some of that for me, please?
I think what we'd got there is people that felt that if you were going to have events, then it should be exclusive events, rather than the 82% who were happy that you might have an event and public access as well. Because what we'd always try and do is to try and do both. So what you've got is those people who feel that actually if you're going to shut it off, if you're going to have an event, just shut it off completely. Then there is also the other people who feel that the grounds should always have complete access to everyone, which is why we do try and facilitate that as much as we can. The site itself is quite well zoned, so you can find that you can do some events and let people carry on. And certainly we've had a couple of wedding receptions, and we've let the public in as well, and that seems to have worked quite well. We'd always shy away from exclusive access, but I think some people feel that perhaps sometimes you have to have exclusive access.
Councillor Becker.
Thanks, Chair. Just to pull the camera back a bit, we need to scrutinise these kind of deals on merit, and just as an aside, David, I would hate for something to come through for Chepstow in this committee and us scrutinise it negatively because we think that Abergavenny will feel slighted. I don't think I mean, it's good to defend our territory, but at the same time,
I wasn't going there at all.
Good. I'm just reiterating. It's fine.
Yeah.
It's good. I didn't think you were. I just wanted to be clear about it.
I'm sure you're going to come back to your question now, Councillor.
Yeah, I am. Basically, at the beginning of this process, I was looking at the business case and agreeing that I think that it was overly optimistic in some ways. But when you say about the 4 to 6 weddings a year, actually that sounds a little less like pie in the sky figures, and it feels a little less shonky. However, there's so much uncertainty here with the lease. There's so much uncertainty with the actualities of the business plan. This sounds like a very positive but tentative first step, and could probably be the kind of thing that we call back, I think, for scrutiny after a decision or as part of that process. So, thank you for all your hard work. I have a feeling it won't be the last that we talk about it, though. So,
Councillor Feakins and then Councillor Dovey.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you all. I don't want to just reiterate that a little bit. I think this is a positive. It's very, very positive. The amount of work that's gone into it is very, very positive. There are some issues which we need to address, but the amount of work that you've done so far is incredible, and it comes across, it shines, in all honesty. But it doesn't get away from the fact that, is it something we need? Is it something that's going to add value? Is it something that's going to be profitable? Or is it something that's just very nice? And it is very nice. Let's not get away from that point. Maybe we could simply reduce the size of the building slightly, or take the porch off it at the one end of the porch, and that would give us the saving enough to not have to fund it from Monmouthshire County Council and rely solely on the Rural Development Capital Fund.
I don't think we'll get much savings out of making it smaller, because actually the cost in terms of lengths of timber beams, etc., is quite a small part of the overall cost.
The porch element would save 50. The porch element would save 40-50 grand, I suspect.
I can talk that through with the architect, but I don't think from what I've discussed with her, I don't think it would, and I think a lot of the costs are in those kind of upfront and things like the cost of putting in electricity and things like that are quite big parts of it, whereas the shaving off the size may not. But I suspect the size is also something that will be looked at as part of the planning. That's certainly something that planning have come back. It was originally slightly bigger than it is at the moment. It didn't have a porch originally. It was more of a rectangular, but sort of having the same footprint that way, but wider. And Caddy suggested it was too large, so we reduced it slightly and put the porch as a kind of a vestibule gathering area that we felt might be quite useful. But the pre-planning application advice has also said that it may still be too large. So I think that's something that's got to be discussed as well. We just wanted to make sure that we'd got something that was big enough to be flexible and useful. And certainly when Gareth Kiddy did his work, he said he would advise that it certainly didn't go below seating around about 120. So we're just mindful that we don't want to kind of shave it too small and then find out that yes, we've made some savings now, but actually it's not viable for what we want to do. So, but yes, I mean, I think those things could be looked at.
Go on, a quick supplementary.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and the only thing I'd say about that is that obviously the removing the porch doesn't remove any of the functionality of the building itself, because there wouldn't be, although it removes the aesthetics, it doesn't remove the functionality. It wouldn't remove any seating or anything like that.
Councillor Dovey.
Just a final thought. And that, sorry, I've got a croaky old throat. Just think what I'd be like otherwise. Always believe in retail as detail, if you like. And you're talking about here having weddings and that sort of thing. And yet you haven't made provision for toilets in this place. And when you were asked about the toilets, you really didn't want to do it. That's the impression I got. Now, if you are using a building for the public to use, and you haven't got toilets in it, you're going to end up with porter cabins around the place, which will make it look absolutely ghastly. And it would just show what lack of thought there has gone into. I
think we've probably touched off some of that already, David. To be fair, the issues about the toilets. We have covered that bit.
My memory slipped, and then I'm sorry about that.
Can I ask a few more questions in terms of the development itself? Where would the specialist tradespeople be sourced? Where the materials are going to be sourced? Is there going to be a considerable supply chain within the county, or are we looking at external people coming in from wherever to put this up?
Okay, so we would go through the procurement procedure, which means putting it on CELTA Wales, which obviously means that it can go far and wide. The architect that we're working with at the moment actually lives in Monmouth, and we got callings from all over, and it was just by chance the best person was from Monmouth, so that was lovely. We are looking to use traditional materials. She is looking at specifying flagstones, probably the Forest of Dean is what she would specify there, and local timber as well. Welsh slate would be lovely, but possibly Welsh slate would be out of the budget. But where we can, we're certainly looking at sourcing where possible. It's, as you're aware, it's quite a traditional structure. So we would be looking for firms that can do that. And obviously being local is great, but I mean we will have to go through the proper procurement process for that. Certainly when we were appointing the architect, we certainly had firms ringing up and just asking about it, many of which come locally. And I think in this area actually there are quite a lot of traditional timber framing in companies, if not from Wales, from Herefordshire. So we've got quite a rich choice of people here, but I mean of course they may come from further away, but we're trying to where the budget allows be as local with the materials as we possibly can.
Okay. And in terms of the staffing challenge as well, because you've obviously indicated that potentially if this project goes ahead and you increase capacity of your events programs over the medium and long term, there's going to be staffing implications there. Now, the feel that I've got was we're going to potentially fall back on ambassadors and volunteers to do this. Given that in our last meeting when we looked at the destination management plan, I think we stressed the needs of ensuring that we continue to deliver a high performance in terms of the quality and the professionalism of our staff, because of tourism being a really, really important driver for the county. What are the long-term implications for particularly for the staff side of things? I just wanted to unpick some of that, please.
So this was part of the work that Gareth did as well. We looked at this. So what we've allowed for in our costings is we've called them events coordinator, but somebody a couple of days a week. Now they may be somebody that actually is employed in other areas of events in the county, or they could be just Abergavenny. I mean, that would need to be looked at, but we were allowing for a salary that would cover about 2 days a week. Up until now, what we tend to do at all the sites is the individual managers have been responsible for it. So my colleague Annie Rainsbury deals with those at Chepstow, and I have done up at Abergavenny up until now. With our change in roles, then Annie's responsible for events across all of the sites. But I think we recognise that it's one thing to be responsible and to look at programming, but to actually physically manage all of those sites across, across three sites is very difficult, which is why we felt if we were going to up our game here, then we needed to have somebody that was more dedicated to it. So we've allowed for that in our costings. We've also allowed that for some events, it would require some outside specialist staff. So things like the historical events, for example, that tends to rely on people that we buy in from outside. The theatre events, obviously, we're paying staff essentially to come in and deliver a service. We've also allowed within the figures for some paid staff, and then we've also allowed for some stewarding. Some volunteers as well, looking really at how we kind of manage it at the moment. So although there would be more events, then we sort of looked at the same structures we have now, which is we might have for a theatre event or something, a member of staff on site who would then be supported by 3 or 4 volunteers, depending on the size of the event or how long it was going on for. So we have a pool of volunteers. Some of them actually happen to be ambassadors as well. So we certainly weren't sort of saying we will rely entirely on Monmouthshire ambassadors, because we do have a big pool of volunteers ourselves. As I say, many of them cross both areas. So yeah, so there's costings in there for both that sort of I suppose officer type post, but also some money as well that's been allowed for in the expenditure for actually you need people on the ground to welcome people in, to sell tickets on the gate, etc. And that was all costed in as well.
Councillor Davis.
I'll be brief, Chairman. There was one question I forgot to ask you, which was, it says in the document that you were looking for additional funding from the Rural Development Fund to support the first 3 years of operation. How much were you looking for those 3 years of operation?
So for the total 3 years, it was just over £44,000 that we've gone to. Yeah, there. So that's and that's about sort of supporting the staff and the events programme as well. So, which is why I said at the beginning we would be looking for it to be sustainable, but we'd need that help over the first 3 years to get to the sustainable point at year 3.
Can I just say, Mr. Chairman, I think we all need to make this clear. Nobody is arguing against Abergavenny having a facility, and I'm sure we'd all, Abergavenny would like it, and I'm sure the people at Abergavenny would like it. I think the point from our perspective is, in the current financial situation we find ourselves in, should the council be loaning £32,000 to this project? And if you were coming to us and saying, look, we don't need any money off the council, we've got grant funding for this, then I think everybody in this room would say, well done, Abergavenny. Great, you've got a lovely facility. It may not be giving any financial benefits, but it's of benefit to the community. I'm looking at it from a different perspective in terms of the current financial position for this authority and whether there's enough benefit for this authority to loan out £32,000 on this project. And I think that's where I have a little bit of difficulty. Okay, but I still think it's a really good document. I wish all the documents we saw were presented as well as this. Thank you.
Okay, so if there's no further questions, just to look to sum up, we've covered a lot there within the business plan, looked at the income generation, and obviously a strong feeling amongst some of the committee here is that, in times of fiscal constraint that we're in, we need to be maximising our money and getting tangible returns, financial returns on that. Although, I think some colleagues have pointed out the community improvement aspect of it, and as an asset, it would be an important community enhancement, as well as potentially delivering some long-term gains to the museum and library services. I think we looked at the aspects of the loan. issue around the lease, I think, is critical, and I think we all want some element of comfort on the lease before any decision is made on the fund itself. I think that was critical, and we looked at other aspects of the business case, staffing challenges, building structure, and whether or not there can be some contributory factors from the town council for this, and what element they're playing in this potential partnership, if it could go ahead as a partnership. We've got some recommendations. So we're recommended to endorse the following prior to the submission to the individual cabinet member decision. So that's the feasibility study and the business case. I've got a feeling that I don't know if there's enough of us to be able to endorse that, or whether or not the particular caveats we want to put in place first, as to give those recommendations to the cabinet member, particularly on the lease. I think that's critical. I'm open to suggestions from colleagues.
If I can just say, Chairman, I can't endorse something that is going to involve the authority making a £32,000 loan, regardless of the lease.
Okay. Councillor Fegans?
I'd say the same. I'd say the same, in as much as I'd find it difficult to endorse it, as we don't know the full facts, and there's some of those facts are so important and keystones that right at this moment in time I couldn't endorse it.
Is that the feeling from everyone else?
I think we need more information. So, if we need more information, can't really endorse it.
So the feeling is that at this stage we can't endorse it until we have further information, particularly in regarding the lease.
Not just the lease, but I think also elements of the loan structure, especially if Lord Abergavenny is amenable to an interest-free loan. That could change the entire dynamic. I mean, we'd all be here applauding it completely if that were the case. So, I mean, we do need some clarification on that.
Okay, so that's the lease, the loan structure going forward. Any other elements that we feel that were not crystal clear at this stage?
Yeah, just some of the construction of the building itself, and we talked about the slabs from the Forest of Dean. Maybe it could be a gravel floor. Brazilian slates are £1.30, Welsh slates are £4 each. Big differences. So maybe there's some trimming to do on the actual construction costs as well, and maybe we could see those differences, and that would help us come to a better decision maybe.
So we're asking officers to go back to the architect to potentially look at some of the development costs and reducing those costs as well. Yeah. Okay.
Maybe very quickly, I understand the point that we as a council, then, even if we do grant this or give this as a loan, obviously at the moment we're asking the development grant for £40,000 as contribution towards cost for the first 3 years. Let's, from a business perspective, you'd say, well, let's say it doesn't break even with the first 3 years. We're still going to be left with a negative position, possibly for 5 years. Not saying it's not on the right path, but even if we were given the 32 grand, even if we did trim back the costs, there's still a starving issue that we need to adopt and be comfortable with moving that position forward. So that's got to be brought into the equation for us as well, I think.
Yeah, good point. Okay, are officers happy to take that away, and you've got to steer on that? Yeah, okay. Councillor Dovey.
Sorry, Chair, I should have my hand up.
Sorry. Can you put your mic on? Sorry, I can't.
I've got my concerns about the retail offer, if you want to call it something like that, and the way it's structured and how the profitability comes out of it, because it's a bit of a mosaic, and I didn't feel secure in what I read and what I heard. I have some areas I want some more clarity on that.
Okay, I think officers have taken that on board as well. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. So our next I've got Hazel on my shoulder. Hello. Okay, yeah, that's a good point in terms of when we can have further information on potentially some of this, roughly.
So you're asking me for a time thing? Yeah. I think with most of this I could get this information together quite quickly because... Oh, sorry. Yes, I think we can get this together quite quickly because I think we've got the issue of, you know, hearing back from loans, getting things into planning, aligning all those things up. Just looking at this, I mean, discussions on the loan can happen very quickly, talking to the architecture. So the architect, sorry. So I don't see that, you know, over the next month we could do this. If that sounds okay. You do? Yeah. Yes. We could do it over the next month.
Over the next month.
Yes.
Well, yeah. Do colleagues, I'm speaking to colleagues now, do you want to potentially add this to the 30th meeting? 30th of November meeting? Would that be doable for you?
If you tell me I'm coming to a meeting on the 30th of November, it will be doable for me.
It's the one in December,
Is it, yeah.
There isn't one in December. The next
No.
one is...
Yeah, Councillor Davis?
I mean, the last thing we want is for you to come back and for us to still have a lot of
yeah,
queries.
of course, yes,
so I think you really need to give yourself adequate time. And perhaps December is a better... Is there a meeting in December? I don't know.
No, the next meeting would be the 25th of January then.
Well, yeah, I think you need... There's a lot of quite, you know, detailed information required there, I think. And I wouldn't put yourself behind the 8 ball if I was you.
The other thing to be mindful on that is that whilst Lord Abergavenny might be very favourable, it'll be a board of trustees that'll be having to go through the grant, go through that lease process, and they'll have legal advisors all over it and blah blah blah. So that's maybe a little loop which could add a little bit of time.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. So if we went for the 25th of January.
Okay. Thank you very much. Can I thank colleagues? Can I thank officers?
Thank you.
One final word. Can I just seek agreement from you that you'd like to add the Crick Road report to the next meeting, which will be the 30th? Are you happy to take that then? Yeah, okay. It will be a little bit of a longer meeting for you because you've got budget scrutiny, which I'm sure you'll relish. But yeah, that's my suggestion rather than calling another special if you're happy to have a slightly longer meeting, okay?
Okay, thank you very much.